Wanted to go ahead and show you this video. This is by Prager University. It's titled, "Why Did the Democratic South Become Republican?" They try to make it look like the South, values have just changed, and the South has just become more conservative, more pro-gun, more pro-small government, and it has nothing to do with race and racism in the South. They don't give the full story, though. Let's go ahead and watch this, and you'll see what I mean.
Once upon a time, every student of history, and that meant pretty much everyone with a high school education, knew this. The Democratic Party was the party of slavery and Jim Crow, and the Republican Party was the party of emancipation and racial integration. Democrats were the Confederacy, and Republicans were the Union. Jim Crow Democrats were dominant in the South, and socially tolerant Republicans were dominant in the North. But then, in the 1960s and 70s, everything supposedly flipped. Suddenly, the Republicans became the racists, and the Democrats became the champions of civil rights. Fabricated by left-leaning academic elites and journalists, the story went like this. Republicans couldn't win a national election by appealing to the better nature of the country. They could only win by appealing to the worst. Attributed to Richard Nixon, the media's all-purpose bad guy, this came to be known as the Southern strategy. It was very simple. Win elections by winning the South, and to win the South, appeal to racists. So the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, were to now be labeled the party of rednecks. But this story...
There's a lot to unpack that she just said. So notice how she talks about how academic elites created this story. Why does the right always talk about academic elites, but they never talk about economic elites who actually have a lot more power? She talks about how the media made Richard Nixon this bad guy. No, he made himself a bad guy. Look at what he did with Watergate. Look at his actions over the years and trying to cover things up with Vietnam War. Like Nixon, no one needs to make him look like a bad guy. His objective actions make him look that way. She just omitted a lot of history concerning the Gilded Age and the labor rights movement, and the fact that Republicans supported big business. Republicans were not looking out for the little guy. And someone like FDR, who was a Democrat, he was progressive in pushing for people's economic rights. FDR's policies prevented the U.S. Economic system from collapsing. Let's go ahead and keep watching then.
Switching identities is a myth. In fact, it's three myths wrapped into one false narrative. Let's take a brief look at each myth in turn. Myth number one. In order to be competitive in the South, Republicans started to pander to white racists in the 1960s. Fact, Republicans actually became competitive in the South as early as 1928 when Republican Herbert Hoover won over 47% of the South's popular vote against Democrat Al Smith. In 1952, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower won the southern states of Tennessee, Florida, and Virginia. And in 1956, he picked up Louisiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia too. And that was after he supported the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated public schools, and after he sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock Central High School to enforce integration. Myth number two. Southern Democrats, angry with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, switched parties. Fact, of the 21 Democratic senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act, just one became a Republican. The other 20 continued to be elected as Democrats or were replaced by other Democrats.
Okay, so notice that she just shifted the narrative. People have been arguing that voters in the South became Republican and started voting Republican. The idea that all the politicians switch right away, like, no, it didn't happen just overnight. A lot of politicians, they continued to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. It looks bad for someone's political career if they switch parties that quickly. And so, yes, some of them did continue to be voted in, but the politicians and the people are different, and she's highlighting specifically what was going on at the national level where there's a lot of resources that go towards incumbents. There's a lot of campaign contributions that go towards incumbents. She doesn't talk as much about the individual states and what was going on with the individual states, and the fact that a lot of politicians were winning that were then Republican in the South, for like state legislatures, for example, governor's races. She's highlighting only a small like really picture of what was really going on.
States didn't go Republican for another 2.5 decades. Myth number 3. Since the implementation of the Southern strategy, the Republicans have dominated the South. Fact: Richard Nixon, the man who is often credited with creating the Southern strategy, lost the Deep South in 1968. In contrast, Democrat Jimmy Carter nearly swept the region in 1976, 12 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in 1992, over 28 years later, Democrat Bill Clinton won Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. The truth is, Republicans didn't hold a majority of Southern congressional seats until 1994, 30 years after the Civil Rights Act. As Kevin Williamson of National Review writes, if Southern rednecks ditched the Democrats because of a civil rights law passed in 1964, it is strange that they waited until the late 1980s and early 1990s to do so. They say things move slower in the South, but not that slow. So what really happened? Why does the South now vote overwhelmingly Republican? Because the South itself has changed. Its values have changed. The racism that once defined it doesn't anymore. Its values today are conservative ones: pro-life, pro-gun, and pro-small government. And here's the proof. Southern whites are far more likely to vote for a black conservative like Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina than a white liberal. In short, history has moved on. Like other regions of the country, the South votes values, not skin color. The myth of the Southern strategy is just the Democrats' excuse for losing the South, and yet another way to smear Republicans with the label racist. Don't buy it. I'm Carol.
You have to question how much Carol Swain is paid by Prager University. Her being a professor seems to cast validity on the things that she's saying. I lived in the South, and I can tell you that there are a lot of racist people. Now, of course, not everyone's racist, but look at the history of the South. This was a group of people that fought to the death to maintain their slaves because they benefited economically. These are people that did everything they could to prevent integration. They wanted segregation to last as long as possible. You look at the Mississippi Freedom Rides and the fact that people of color were being killed, and just people that were riding those freedom buses were being killed. Now, understand that people pass ideas and culture down to their kids, and so I can assure you that the South still has racism. Now, of course, again, not everyone is. The idea that people only care about like values in the South, okay, you have to ask the question, if you have a black conservative and a white conservative both running, who's going to have a better chance then? Really, you just have to question why Prager University, why they don't always give a complete picture of what's going on. Why they will argue anything they can to promote a certain point of view in video after video after video. The idea that the South votes Republican solely because they're pro-gun and pro-small government, like, that's a really convenient thought if you're conservative, but it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and it doesn't hold up to academic research. The idea that these people, they're just elitist academic like snobs, like that's the exact idea that the wealthy and the powerful want the public to believe. They want the attention to be diverted to the academic elites, but then the idea of the wealthy elites to never be discussed. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe. There'll be more coming out on history and politics.